In the quiet suburb of Willow Grove, where manicured lawns and pastel mailboxes lined the streets like soldiers on parade, a storm was brewing. It wasn't the kind you'd see on the Weather Channel, but one born of pride, principle, and a pile of unwanted gravel. At the heart of it was Walter Hayes, a 74-year-old retired Navy mechanic with a temper as sharp as a tack and a knack for turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Walter wasn't your typical grandfather. He built birdhouses from old license plates, taught squirrels to fetch bottle caps, and kept a backyard hot tub wired to a salvaged radio antenna for reasons no one dared question. To me, his 50-year-old daughter Ellen, moving back into his home with my son Jamie after my husband's passing, felt like stepping into a carnival run by a mad genius. Willow Grove was governed by the iron fist of the Homeowners Association, newly led by Raymond Baxter, a man who wore khakis so crisp they could stand on their own. Raymond had been president for barely 6 weeks, but his reign felt eternal. He patrolled the neighborhood with a clipboard, issuing fines for infractions like excessive flower vibrancy or non-compliant fence opacity. His loafers clicked on the pavement like a metronome, and his smile was the kind that made you check your pockets. Most folks grumbled but complied. Walter, however, was not like most folks. The trouble began with a treehouse. Not for Jamie, who at 17 was more interested in his phone than climbing trees, but for the neighborhood kids. Walter saw it as his duty to give them a fortress of imagination, a sturdy oak platform with a rope ladder, fairy lights powered by a solar panel, and a lookout tower he jokingly called the Admiral's Nest. The kids loved it. Raymond did not. He declared it an unauthorized vertical anomaly that disrupted the aesthetic cohesion of Willow Grove. A fine arrived, followed by a demolition order. Walter read the notice, folded it into a paper airplane, and launched it into his fire pit. "If he wants to tear down my castle," he said, his eyes glinting like polished steel, "I'll bury his kingdom in rocks." 2 days later, the gravel arrived. It wasn't a polite delivery. A dump truck roared into our cul-de-sac at dawn, unloading a mountain of jagged stones onto the edge of our property. It crushed my lavender bed, flattened a row of tulips, and sent 2 of Walter's prized ceramic frogs to an early grave. The driver handed Jamie a form signed by Raymond, citing drainage correction under HOA bylaws. It was no accident, it was a declaration of war. I tried to play diplomat, baking blueberry scones and marching to the HOA office to reason with Raymond. He thanked me for the scones, handed me a citation for non-regulation mailbox height, and suggested I trim our hedges to community standards. I came home defeated. Walter, however, was just getting started. That night, I found him in the garage, surrounded by wrenches, duct tape, and what looked like a lawnmower engine strapped to a wheelbarrow. "Ellen," he said, barely looking up, "grab a flashlight. We're taking a stroll." Against my better judgment, I followed. Raymond's backyard pool was the crown jewel of his property, a sparkling oasis framed by foam marble columns and lit by underwater LEDs. It was as pretentious as its owner, and it screamed for justice. Walter, with the agility of a man half his age, scaled the fence, pushed the wheelbarrow to the pool's edge, and tipped a load of gravel into the water. The stones sank with a satisfying plunk, rippling the pristine surface like a middle finger to Raymond's ego. He turned to me, nodded once, and sauntered back home. I stood there, heart pounding, wondering if I'd just become an accomplice to a felony. The next morning, Raymond was apoplectic. He posted photos on the HOA app with captions like, "Vandalism is not neighborly." Walter printed them out and taped them to the fridge, calling them modern art. But Raymond wasn't one to back down. He installed motion sensor lights, started skulking around his yard with a camcorder, and filed a police report. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, some horrified, others delighted. For Walter, it was a call to arms. He began sketching plans on napkins, muttering about tactical escalation. I begged him to stop, but his grin told me this was no longer about the treehouse. It was about respect, about drawing a line in the sand against a man who thought rules trumped people. By the third gravel drop, Walter had turned our garage into a war room. He recruited allies, the Peterson brothers, Tim and Nate, college kids with a drone and a 3D printer. Miss Clara, a 68-year-old Pilates instructor who'd been fined for her wind chimes. And George, a conspiracy theorist who owned a van full of surveillance gear, and believed the HOA was a front for the IRS. They called themselves the Resistance, and their mission was simple: return every last pebble to Raymond's pool, one defiant splash at a time. I watched, torn between horror and admiration, as my father transformed from a quirky retiree into a suburban guerrilla leader. The question wasn't whether we'd get caught, it was how far we'd go before we did. The gravel war in Willow Grove escalated faster than a summer wildfire. What began as a single act of defiance, Walter dumping a wheelbarrow of stones into Raymond Baxter's pristine pool, had ignited a rebellion. By the end of the first week, our garage was no longer just a place to park the car. It was a command center, complete with a chalkboard covered in diagrams, a coffee pot that never stopped brewing, and a stack of pizza boxes that served as our war rations. Walter, at 74, had the energy of a man possessed. He paced the concrete floor, barking orders like the Navy mechanic he'd once been, while Jamie, my 17-year-old son, scribbled notes and tried not to laugh at his grandfather's theatrics. Our team, the Resistance, was a motley crew. Tim and Nate Peterson, the 20-year-old twins from down the street, brought technical wizardry to the table. They'd rigged a drone they called Skyhawk to scout Raymond's backyard, mapping every motion sensor and floodlight. Miss Clara, with her Pilates-honed strength and a grudge against Raymond's wind chime ban, was our lookout, her sharp eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. George, the neighborhood eccentric, insisted the HOA was a government psyop, but proved invaluable with his night vision goggles and a Wi-Fi jammer he swore was military-grade. Ellen, was the reluctant quartermaster, keeping track of supplies and praying we wouldn't end up in handcuffs. The strategy was simple but bold. Keep the gravel flowing into Raymond's pool, but do it so subtly he'd question his sanity. Walter called it psychological landscaping. The first mission was a test run. While Raymond was out on his morning HOA patrol, clipboard in hand, we struck. Miss Clara stood guard at the corner, pretending to water her azaleas. Tim and Nate hacked the HOA app to post a fake notice about pool maintenance, keeping Raymond distracted. George jammed Raymond's security cameras with what he called spectral interference, though it looked suspiciously like a modified garage door opener. Jamie and I crept to the pool with a grocery bag of gravel, tied with a ribbon and a tag that read, "Courtesy of Willow Grove." We dumped it on the pool deck and vanished into the shadows. Raymond's reaction was pure theater. He stood by his pool for a full minute, staring at the bag like it was a bomb. Then he erupted, storming the HOA group chat with accusations of criminal trespass and suburban anarchy. Miss Clara responded with a gif of a winking cat. The twins edited Raymond's security footage to show him tripping over a hose, and the clip spread like wildfire among the neighbors. The war was on, and we were winning, at least for now. But Raymond wasn't a pushover. He doubled down, turning his property into a fortress. Floodlights blazed every night, casting eerie glows across the cul-de-sac. He installed a doorbell camera that sent alerts to his phone every time a squirrel sneezed. He even hired a private security consultant, a wiry guy named Vince who drove a black SUV and wore sunglasses indoors. Raymond's HOA patrols became more aggressive. He fined the Millers for unorthodox shrub shaping, cited Miss Clara for auditory disturbance because her wind chimes tinkled too loudly, and slapped George with a violation for suspicious vehicle modifications. He even tried to have our dog, Boomer, declared a nuisance animal after Boomer barked at him during a jog. The man was unraveling, but he was also fighting back. Walter, undeterred, turned the Resistance into a machine. The twins built a pulley system to lower gravel into the pool from the fence line, using a fishing rod and a plastic bucket. Miss Clara muffled the sound with yoga mats, draping them over the fence like a ninja. George monitored Raymond's cameras, feeding us real-time updates through walkie-talkies he claimed were untraceable. Walter orchestrated it all, sketching drop zones and contingency plans on his chalkboard. One night, we used a PVC pipe launcher the twins rigged up, firing a cloud of gravel into the pool like a silent storm. Another time, we coated the stones in glow-in-the-dark paint, turning Raymond's pool into a radioactive art installation. He called a hazmat team, and we laughed until our sides hurt. The neighborhood was starting to take sides. Some residents, loyal to Raymond's vision of order, reported suspicious activity to the HOA. Others, fed up with his tyranny, quietly cheered us on. A tray of rock-shaped cookies appeared on our porch one morning and signed. The mailman started humming Sweet Home Alabama as he dropped off our bills. Even the Thompsons, a new family who'd barely unpacked, whispered their support after Raymond fined them for an inflatable Santa. The resistance wasn't just about gravel Anna Maria, it was about pushing back against a man who thought he could bully a community into submission. But the stakes were rising. Raymond called an emergency HOA meeting, dragging his cousin Carl, a lawyer with a comb-over and a cheap suit, to threaten us with terms like malicious interference and property desecration. The room was divided, half nodding along with Raymond, half stifling grins. Walter sat silently until Raymond accused us of gravel terrorism. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, and said, "You dumped a ton of rocks on my daughter's yard because you didn't like a treehouse. Tell me who's the terrorist." The silence that followed was electric. The meeting dissolved into chaos, and Raymond stormed out, vowing to restore order. Back home, Walter was already planning the next phase. He stood by the gravel pile, now half its original size, and muttered, "If he wants a war, we'll give him a legend." I knew that look. It was the same one he'd had when he caught a raccoon stealing his tomatoes and spent a week building a trap out of soup cans and bungee cords. The resistance was about to go big, and I wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. One thing was certain: Raymond Baxter had no idea what was coming. The gravel war in Willow Grove had become more than a neighborhood spat. It was a full-blown saga, whispered about at barbecues and debated in the HOA group chat. Walter Hayes, my 74-year-old father, had transformed from a quirky retiree into the mastermind of a suburban uprising. His resistance team, Ellen, my son Jamie, the Peterson twins, Miss Clara, and George, was no longer just dumping gravel into Raymond Baxter's pool. We were waging a campaign of precision chaos, each pebble a middle finger to Raymond's clipboard tyranny. But as the stakes climbed, so did the risks, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath us. Raymond wasn't just fighting back, was fortifying. His backyard looked like a low-budget spy movie set. Motion sensors screeched at passing cats, floodlights turned night into day, and a new drone buzzed over the cul-de-sac, its red eye blinking like a sci-fi villain. He'd upgraded his security system with cameras that sent live feeds to his phone, and he'd hired Vince, the sunglasses-wearing consultant, to patrol the neighborhood in his black SUV. Raymond's HOA fines grew more unhinged. The Wilsons were cited for excessive porch chair tilt, and Miss Clara got a warning for provocative garden gnome positioning. He even tried to ban Boomer, our golden retriever, from the community park after the dog chased a squirrel too close to his mailbox. The man was losing it, but he was also tightening the noose. Walter, however, thrived on the challenge. The garage, now a war room straight out of a heist flick, hummed with activity. The Peterson twins, Tim and Nate, had upgraded their drone, Skyhawk, with thermal imaging to track Raymond's movements. They'd also built a slingshot contraption that could lob gravel over the fence from 20 feet away, powered by a repurposed leaf blower. Miss Clara choreographed our missions like a dance routine, using her Pilates flexibility to slip through hedges unnoticed. George, convinced the drones were part of a federal compliance grid, rigged a signal scrambler from old CB radios, though I suspected it just annoyed Raymond's Wi-Fi. Walter orchestrated it all, his chalkboard now a labyrinth of arrows, timetables, and a stick figure Raymond labeled Target Prime with a villainous mustache. Our operations grew bolder. One night, we used the twin slingshot to scatter gravel across Raymond's pool tarp, turning it into a lumpy gray canvas. Another time, Miss Clara posed as a jogger to distract Vince while Jamie and I slipped a bucket of stones through a gap in the fence. The gravel piled up at the bottom of the pool, invisible until Raymond's pool guy vacuumed it up, only for it to return the next night. Walter called it the Pebble Plague, and it was driving Raymond to the edge. He started interrogating neighbors, banging on doors to demand security footage. He posted rants on the HOA app, quoting bylaws like a preacher wielding scripture. His once perfect hair was a frazzled mess, and his khakis had creases in all the wrong places. The neighborhood was a powder keg. Some residents, loyal to Raymond's vision of order, reported suspicious figures to the HOA. Others, fed up with his reign, slipped us intel. The Thompsons, still shell-shocked from their inflatable Santa fine, left a note in our mailbox. "Keep it up." He found our kids' lemonade stand. The mailman started winking when he delivered our letters. Even Mrs. Larson, a 90-year-old widow who rarely left her porch, sent us a tin of oatmeal cookies with a scrawled message, "Give him hell." The resistance wasn't just a prank crew. Anna Maria was a movement, and Walter was its reluctant general. But the war wasn't without cost. Raymond's drones caught blurry footage of Jamie near his fence, and a cease and desist letter arrived, naming me and Walter as perpetrators of malicious property interference. I nearly had a heart attack. I stormed into the garage, where Walter was tinkering with a gravel-flinging catapult, and begged him to stop. "This isn't a game, Dad," I said. "We could lose the house." He didn't look up, just kept tightening a bolt. Then he walked to a rusty filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a folder labeled Baxter, R. Inside were years of dirt photos of Raymond's unapproved pool heater, receipts for his illegal fence extension, even a 2010 HOA complaint about his tasteless holiday flamingo. Walter had been watching Raymond longer than I'd realized. "This," he said, holding up the folder like a grenade, "is our insurance." I stared, speechless. The gravel war had started as a lark, but Walter had been playing chess while Raymond played checkers. The folder wasn't just leverage, it was a weapon. And then came the bombshell. Miss Clara, sipping chamomile tea during a strategy session, casually mentioned a conversation with Raymond's ex-wife, Linda, at a Pilates class. Linda had kept meticulous records, including proof that Raymond hadn't filed his HOA presidency renewal forms last year. Technically, he wasn't even the president. The room went silent. George muttered something about bureaucratic checkmate. Jamie grinned like he'd won the lottery. Walter just nodded, his eyes gleaming. "We've got him," he said. "Now we bury him." The plan shifted from guerrilla tactics to a knockout punch. We'd present our case at an HOA grievance hearing, exposing Raymond's hypocrisy and invalid presidency. The twins digitized Walter's files, building a slideshow that could have doubled as a courtroom exhibit. George tracked down a former HOA treasurer who confirmed Raymond had fudged a maintenance invoice for a tax write-off. Miss Clara rallied neighbors to attend the hearing, framing it as a chance to reclaim Willow Grove. I was tasked with keeping the operation secret, no small feat, when half the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. The hearing was 2 weeks away, and the tension was suffocating. Raymond, sensing trouble, doubled his patrols, his drone now hovering over our roof at odd hours. He even tried to suspend our family from the community garden, claiming our disruptive behavior threatened the roses. One night, as we tested a new gravel-dropping pulley, Walter pulled me aside. "Ellen," he said, his voice softer than usual, "this isn't just about the gravel. It's about showing folks like Baxter that power doesn't come from a title. It comes from people standing together." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood. All I knew was that my father, with his stubborn heart and Navy grit, had turned a pile of rocks into a revolution. The hearing loomed like a storm cloud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were either headed for glory or disaster. The air in Willow Grove was thick with anticipation, like the calm before a thunderstorm. The gravel war had reached its boiling point, and the upcoming HOA grievance hearing was no longer just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Walter Hayes, my 74-year-old father, had turned our family's feud with Raymond Baxter into a neighborhood uprising. His resistance team, Ellen, my son Jamie, the Peterson twins, Miss Clara, and George had spent weeks turning Raymond's pool into a gravel quarry, each stone a jab at his iron-fisted rule. But now, with Raymond's cease and desist letter threatening lawsuits and our evidence stack growing, the game had changed. We weren't just pranksters anymore. We were insurgents, and the hearing would decide whether we'd topple a tyrant or crash and burn. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. Our garage, once a cluttered workshop, was now a nerve center. Walter's chalkboard tracked every detail: Raymond's schedule, his security upgrades, and our drop zones for the ongoing gravel campaign. The Peterson twins, Tim and Nate, worked around the clock, turning Walter's dusty files into a digital war machine. Their slideshow highlighted Raymond's violations: unapproved pool heaters, illegal fence heights, and a 2012 incident involving an unpermitted tiki torch that nearly set his garage on fire. They added animated arrows and zoomed-in signatures, making it look like a courtroom drama. Miss Clara, our Pilates guru, canvassed the neighborhood, rallying support with her charm and a tray of lemon bars. George, ever the conspiracy nut, insisted on encrypting our group chat, dubbing it Stone Command, and assigning us code names. Walter was Iron Admiral. I was Beacon. He wanted to be Pebble King, but we vetoed it. Raymond, meanwhile, was spiraling. His once pristine yard was a paranoid fortress caution taped around the pool, floodlights flickering like a prison yard, and motion sensors that screamed at passing birds. He'd taken to pacing his driveway at night, muttering into a walkie-talkie, his khakis swapped for sweat-stained polos. His HOA app posts were unhinged, ranting about subversive elements and quoting obscure bylaws. He'd even hired a second drone, which the twins promptly hacked, redirecting it to buzz his car. But his boldest move came a week before the hearing. A neighborhood brunch by his pool, complete with flyers, a string quartet, and artisanal pastries. He attempted to reclaim his image as the poised leader of Willow Grove. Walter saw it as an opportunity. We didn't crash the brunch that would have been too obvious. Instead, we sabotaged it with surgical precision. The twins had studied Raymond's pool filter, a high-end model prone to clogging. Over the past week, we'd funneled extra gravel through a hidden pipe, letting it build up in the system. At 10:45 a.m., as Raymond toasted his guests with a mimosa, the filter let out a groan, then a screech, then exploded in a geyser of gravel-flecked water. Pastries flew, the quartet screeched to a halt, and Raymond, drenched in pool sludge, hurled a pool skimmer into a bush. He grabbed a microphone while he had won at a brunch, I'll never know, and ranted about sabotage and the death of civility. Someone filmed it, and by lunch, the video was trending in 3 neighborhood Facebook groups. The Thompsons, still stinging from their Santa fine, captioned it, Baxter's Meltdown, the movie. Raymond's retaliation was swift. A formal complaint arrived, naming me, Walter, and Jamie as defendants in a lawsuit for property destruction and emotional distress. My heart sank. I'd been the voice of caution, begging Walter to dial it back, and now our home was on the line. I confronted him in the garage, where he was polishing a gravel-flinging slingshot. Dad, this has to stop, I pleaded. We're not just fighting a jerk, we're risking everything. He looked at me, his eyes steady, and said, Ellen, sometimes you fight not because it's safe, but because it's right. Then he opened his filing cabinet and handed me the Baxter file. Read this, he said, then decide if you're with me. The file was a bombshell. Walter had documented Raymond's every misstep, forged invoices, unreported renovations, even a 2009 photo of Raymond accepting a Yard of the Month award next to an illegal plastic pelican. But the real game-changer came from Miss Clara. During a Pilates session with Raymond's ex-wife, Linda, she'd uncovered a notarized letter stating Raymond hadn't filed his HOA presidency renewal. Legally, he was a fraud. We had him, not just on hypocrisy, but on a technicality that could strip him of power. Walter grinned like a fox. We don't just want his pool, he said. We want his crown. The hearing was held at the Willow Grove Community Center, a beige box usually reserved for book clubs and yoga classes. By 9 a.m., it was packed, neighbors spilling into the aisles. Miss Clara brought iced tea and a folding chair. George wore a GoPro, muttering about historical record. The twins live-streamed to their meme page, titled Baxter's Last Stand. Walter arrived in a faded blazer, clutching a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. Jamie and I flanked him, my stomach churning. This wasn't just about grave lit, was about our home, our community, and whether we could stand up to a bully without losing everything. Raymond strode in with his cousin Carl, the discount lawyer, and a stack of folders labeled evidence. He looked haggard but defiant, his tie knotted too tightly. The HOA board, led by a frazzled retiree named Harold, opened the hearing with a drone of procedural rules. Raymond went first, his voice dripping with rehearsed calm. He projected slides of gravel in his pool, blurry footage of Jamie near his fence, and a 5-minute clip of Boomer barking, which he called sonic harassment. The crowd snickered, but Raymond pressed on, accusing us of orchestrated vandalism and psychological warfare. Carl waved a legal pad, muttering about punitive damages. Then it was Walter's turn. He stood, slow and deliberate, and opened his binder. I'm not here to talk about feelings, he said. I'm here to talk about facts. He laid out the gravel incident, how Raymond dumped a ton of rocks on our yard, killing my lavender and breaking HOA rules on unapproved landscaping. He showed the signed delivery form, proving Raymond's involvement. He flipped to photos of Raymond's violations: the unpermitted pool heater, the illegal fence, the tiki torch fiasco. The twin slideshow brought it to life, zooming in on signatures and timestamps. The room leaned forward, neighbors whispering. Raymond tried to interrupt, but Harold silenced him. Then Miss Clara stood, unannounced, and handed the board Linda's notarized letter. Raymond Baxter, she said, her voice clear as a bell, is not the HOA president. He failed to renew his term, per Section 4.2 of the bylaws. The room exploded: gasps, shouts, someone yelling, "Gotcha!" Harold called a recess, and the board vanished into a back room, their faces pale. 10 minutes later, they returned. Harold cleared his throat. Due to procedural oversight, Raymond Baxter is removed as HOA president, effective immediately. Cheers erupted. Raymond deflated, his folders slipping to the floor. Carl shrugged and shuffled out. Someone hummed "Sweet Caroline" as the meeting adjourned. We walked into the sunlight, Walter's shoulders straighter than I'd seen in years. The fines were dropped, an apology issued for the gravel dump, and a new election scheduled. That night, the neighborhood threw a barbecue, kids chasing fireflies, adults laughing like old friends. Raymond's house was dark, his pool closed for decontamination. Boomer, ever the hero, marked his mailbox. Walter handed me a polished pebble, winking. For the scrapbook, he said. But I knew this wasn't the end, not quite. Victory in Willow Grove tasted like barbecue smoke and lemonade, a sweetness tempered by the memory of the fight. The gravel war, which had consumed our lives for weeks, ended with Raymond Baxter's fall at the HOA hearing. Stripped of his presidency, his pool a gravel-filled ruin, Raymond retreated behind closed curtains, leaving the neighborhood to breathe freely for the first time in months. Walter Hayes, my 74-year-old father, had led the resistance team. Ellen, my son Jamie, the Peterson twins, Miss Clara, and Giorgito, a triumph that felt like something out of a movie. But as the dust settled, I wondered, what happens when the war is over? Do heroes just go back to pruning hedges? The days after the hearing were strangely quiet. Walter, who'd been a whirlwind of strategy and defiance, seemed adrift without a battle. He repainted the mailbox twice, reorganized the spice rack by color, and started giving Boomer, our golden retriever, mock military commands like "flank the squirrel, soldier." I caught him one morning staring at the spot where the gravel pile once loomed, his coffee cooling in his hand. "Feels like I finished a book and forgot how to read," he muttered. I knew what he meant. The war had given us purpose, a shared enemy in Raymond's clipboard tyranny. Now, with peace restored, we had to figure out who we were without the fight. The HOA board moved fast to fill the void. 3 days after Raymond's ousting, they held an emergency vote and named Miss Clara interim president until the fall election. Her first act was to lift the ban on wind chimes, her porch soon jingling like a symphony. She renamed the HOA newsletter from the Willow Standard to the Harmony Herald, printed on recycled paper with a daisy border. Her second act was a community meeting, not to scold, but to listen. Neighbors, hesitant at first, opened up. The Garcias pitched a community garden. The Hendersons suggested a stargazing night. Even the Thompsons, still wary after Raymond's inflatable Santa debacle, offered to host a chili cook-off. It was as if Raymond's reign had bottled up the neighborhood spirit, and Miss Clara had popped the cork. Walter, predictably, was skeptical of the new harmony. "Peace is just war taking a nap," he grumbled. But he threw himself into a new project to keep busy. It started with a single garden gnome, a 3-foot behemoth he named Stonewall the Sentinel. He planted it at the edge of our yard, facing Raymond's silent house, its arms crossed like a bouncer. Walter built a pedestal from scrap wood, decorating it with broken tiles and glass beads from my old craft bin. Around it, he planted marigolds, sage, and a sprig of lavender in memory of my crushed garden. At the base, he embedded a plaque, in honor of the fallen pebbles and the spirit of defiance. He rigged a solar spotlight to illuminate it at night, and Stonewall became an instant hit. Neighbors added their gnomes, turning our yard into the Victory Garden. Miss Clara, now president, declared it an official community landmark, and set the last Saturday in June as Unity Day, complete with a city council photo op. The neighborhood wasn't the only thing changing. Jamie, now 18 and heading to college, wrote his admissions essay about the gravel war, calling it a lesson in community resilience. It earned him an early acceptance to a state university, and I caught him polishing a pebble from the war to keep on his dorm desk. I found my rhythm, replanting my lavender and joining Miss Clara's Pilates class, where I laughed through warrior poses and felt a weight lift I hadn't noticed I was carrying. Walter, meanwhile, was back to his old tricks, sketching plans for a backyard fountain he swore would outshine Baxter's pool. He was alive again, his Navy grit undimmed, but I saw something new in Hema quiet pride, not in the war, but in what it had built. Raymond, for his part, faded into the background. His pool stayed shuttered, its pumps clogged beyond repair. The drone stopped flying, the floodlights went dark, and his HOA app profile went silent. Rumors swirled. He was job hunting at the county planning office, or writing a manifesto titled Order Under Fire, a suburban tragedy. I didn't care. Part of me hoped he'd found peace, or at least a good counselor. The war had been about principle, not personal destruction, and I wanted to believe even Raymond could learn from it. Months later, I found the last pebble wedged under a porch planter. It was small, smooth, unremarkable until you knew its story. I slipped it into my pocket, a reminder of the nights we'd crept through shadows, the laughter in the garage, the moment we'd stood up to a bully and won. That evening, Walter and I sat on the porch, he with his sweet tea, me with a glass of wine. Boomer chased moths under the glow of Stonewall spotlight. The neighborhood hummed with life kids biking, porch lights flickering, the soft clink of Miss Clara's wind chimes. Think we'll ever get another Baxter? I asked. Walter snorted. There's always another one. Same suit, different smirk. He sipped his tea, eyes scanning the street like a captain on watch. Are you ready if there is? I smiled, feeling the pebble in my pocket. Let them make the first move. We sat in silence, the kind that comes after a hard-fought victory, when you know the battle was worth it. Walter grinned, that old mischievous spark flaring. Got an idea for that fountain yet? He said. I'm thinking jets, lights, maybe a gnome that spits water. I laughed, knowing peace in Willow Grove was never truly permanent, but we'd earned it, one pebble at a time. The gravel war wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a testament to what happens when people stand together against petty power. Walter taught us that rules don't trump respect, and a community isn't built on fines, but on trust. Stonewall the Sentinel still stands, a quirky monument to a neighborhood that refused to bend. And somewhere, in a drawer, that last pebble waits, ready for the next fight if it ever comes. Thank you for joining us on this wild ride through the gravel war of Willow Grove. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Was the resistance justified in their rebellion, or did they go too far? How do you view the balance between standing up to injustice and respecting authority? Share your stance on confronting bullies in your own life, whether it's a pushy HOA president, a workplace tyrant, or any form of unfair power. Let's spark a conversation about courage, community, and where you draw the line. Your voice matters, so dive in and let us know what you think.